Welcome to our Backyard Brothers podcast. We are talking baseball today. It's been a while since we've talked baseball. We talked back in March about the season, and it seemed like we were so confident about what was going to happen this year. There's a fun the famous Chris Berman, who did a lot of uh, NFL highlights, and ESPN had a phrase that I think is very applicable today. He says, "That's why they play the games," and that goes a lot into today. And so, back in March, three of us predicted a World Series um, matchup between the New York Yankees and the San Diego Padres. Neither team has made the playoffs. um, so, and both of them are surprising. Obviously, the Yankees are tying the one of the longest or the biggest drops from one season to another. They won 100 games last year. They're not gonna. I think they might hit 500 this year, but and so a lot of it deals with injuries. A lot of it deals with errors in the infield and the outfield, and just not playing very good defensive baseball. But and then the Padres just. I'm still unsure what happened with the Padres, but there's a few other teams that we predicted. We said the New York Mets would get far, and they abandoned ship and threw all their pieces everywhere else. But so what happened to those three teams in particular? That why these three teams that we thought would be a big player in the postseason didn't even make the final 12 or whatever.
For the Mets, I think we were all caught up in all the big shiny pieces that they put into place. You know, you have a rotation with Verlander and Scherzer and so forth, and you think that you're getting them in their prime, and they both had. And I think in particular, Scherzer's case, kind of extended absences and performance. Verlander, he had a few Verlander games, but it just didn't gel for them. The chemistry, for whatever reason, is not there. And yeah, the honeymoon was over very quickly, with the Mets. And, it's going to be interesting to see what they do, in the off season. They're one of the rumored landing places for Shohei Ohtani. So, but it's, that in some ways it seems like they're trying to replicate the old, Yankees solution of throwing money, to fill in a position, and it doesn't always come together. Yankees, it was. I think a lot of players underperformed this year. I think it didn't help that this is the first year in a little bit that Aaron Judge has not been, a consistent presence on the field. He still had a good year, but he had I forget how long it was that he was out of the lineup, but they definitely missed having him. That's the captain. So by the time he came back, kind of the damage had already been done. I'm a little surprised that they continue to hang on to Brian Cashman. He's gone through this fire multiple times now, and somehow he always comes out of it. But that's going to be a decision after this season that I think they're going to have to look at long and hard. Is what's going on at the GM level. San Diego, I think Machado was limited somewhat, ended up in more of a DH role at the end, not as able to play the field. Juan Soto had a good year. Batting average is not where we've seen it in the past. I think pitchers have started to figure him out a little bit, but he, um, he picked it up. He's hitting a little over 270, I think now. The run production has come back, but again, the pieces around him, something is just not gelling there. A lot of talk, at the end of the season about what the clubhouse and what the atmosphere was like, behind the scenes. They're another team that's considering a management change at the end of the year because of all the underperforming. And it's gonna be interesting too, because they're gonna likely lose a couple of key pieces. Blake Snell's gonna be a free agent. Hader's gonna be a free agent. So, we'll see what they decide to do. And there's already talk of, what happens if they trade Juan Soto, what can they get for him, blah, blah, blah. So, it's but they've got four really huge contracts on that team, and I don't know how long they can realistically keep all of that together.
Yeah, the last team I wanted to talk about as far as why they fell off, I think we mentioned the Cleveland Guardians could sleepwalk their way to an AL Central title. They're not making the playoffs either. And it's a bad way to send off Terry Francona, but
Yeah.
what happened with Cleveland?
I think, well, they are playing under 500. I think in their case, it's probably a case of I don't think Jose Rodriguez had quite the dominant year that we're expecting from him. I think the pitching probably was not as strong. But some of it, I'm hoping that the record shows that somebody among the four of us said that Minnesota could jump Cleveland.
Now, I don't think any of us said that, but I did say that the Twins could have a good shot of hanging with them all the way and making the playoffs as a wild card. But I don't think any of us actually said the Twins could jump them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was hoping.
Maybe Dustin did actually. I'm trying to remember about the Twins.
Well, so it's interesting looking at that division, right? The AL Central is just a weak division where the Twins won it, but they're only barely over 500, right? Compared to, say, the the NL East, right? Very strong division that's most likely going to send three teams to the playoffs, with obviously the Braves, Phillies, and Marlins there, the Mets had to compete with, and so it is interesting to look at the Twins and the Guardians division and how the Twins were able to win that just by surviving, basically.
Yeah. And surviving without Buxton for significant periods. So, but yeah, it's an awful division. It's like the mirror universe version of the AL East, where you still have potential for all five teams to, be 500 or better. So,
yeah.
And what's I think funniest, real quick, is if I remember correctly, I said that I think Kansas City was going to win the division.
Yeah. Well, and Dustin was he's morally obligated to not pick the Yankees, and so he picked the Red Sox, but they obviously didn't do any good either. But there's some teams that did a lot better than we thought that they could. There's a couple of big surprises, but we'll get to that in a second. We're kind of talking about the MLB playoffs while there's 2 games still left in the regular season, and so some teams are still fighting for those last playoff spots. There's today and tomorrow of the regular season, and then playoffs start on Tuesday. But so let's jump in and talk a little bit about some obvious playoff teams. The Atlanta Braves, obviously the best team in baseball at this point. Um, they're the best hitting team. They're the best scoring team. Their offense is crazy, uh, and so uh, maybe the favorite to move on. They made it all the way to the NL championship last year and lost to the Phillies. And can this be one where they go all the way? Is this a World Series championship team? Yeah.
The lineup, no question. They've got I forget where Matt Olson is right now. What, 54 home runs? I mean, everybody would be talking about him if it weren't for Ronald Acuna. And Acuna probably is wrapping up an MVP season. I think he's probably the only real competition that he had was Mookie Betts, and I think Ronald has kind of separated himself from Mookie, the last week or two. Having you stop and think about the numbers, 40 home runs, 40 home runs with 50 steals would have been awesome. With 60 steals, never done. 40 home runs and 70 steals. Having that at the top of your lineup is just, nobody wants to see that coming. And the middle of the Braves lineup has produced really well. Austin Riley's had a good year. Matt Olson's had a good year. Some of the other players around them, Ozzie Albies and Michael Harris. That lineup is arguably the best that's out there. The question is going to be pitching. Having Charlie Morton go on the IL within the last week is not going to help. They've got some guys, Max Fried coming back, who, it hasn't reached quite Max Fried levels yet. Spencer Strider is leading the league in wins. I think I know it's chalk, but I think Atlanta is, has got to be the favorite.
Staying in the NL, and Dustin mentioned the NL East previously, but there's three teams in here. There's the Phillies, who showed that they're as good as last year. They're good as ever. They actually won more games than they did last year, and they won that top wild card spot where they're going to host a wild card game. And then the Marlins surprised everyone, and they hold tiebreakers against all of the other wild card teams, wild card hopefuls, I should say. And so they're almost certainly going to go to the playoffs. All they have to do is tie any of them for records. But so you'll have three teams in the NL East probably in the playoffs, and that's a pretty strong division.
Yeah, what's really interesting about the playoffs this year is that in each league you have the potential for a four-way tie. And in the National League, it's four teams competing for two spots. It's Miami, it's Arizona. Those are the two teams that are in right now. And just within a game or two of them, still have Chicago, still have Cincinnati. Chicago, they're limping into it. They've had a terrible stretch, when they needed it most, and they actually have dropped out of playoff contention at this point, out of the wild card slots. And their last two games are against Atlanta. So not looking wonderful for the Cubs. I do not expect them to be in it at the end. Cincinnati is finishing off against St. Louis, who has been another, expected a little bit of a drop off from them. I was not expecting a first to last. Yeah. So Cincinnati has a chance to make things interesting. and then Arizona is another interesting story because they're finishing off against Houston, and Houston is in their own fight for a playoff spot and not at all guaranteed to make it. So that there are a couple of really critical series that are going on right now. Arizona, Houston being one, Texas, Seattle being another. You know, when we start talking about the American League West, you know, it's you know that's Wild West out there. That is a crazy division right now. But if you know, like you said, you know, Miami's got the tiebreakers. It's a hard call. That Arizona, if they can split the last couple of games with Houston, I think Arizona and Miami get in. I think Chicago and Cincinnati miss out. And if Chicago misses out, I think that's the end of Dave Ross's time in Chicago. That the collapse at the end, I think, was pretty hard for them to go through. But now Philly is a team that I think everybody needs to be scared of Philadelphia. When they got Bryce back in the lineup, that lineup just went on a tear. They played themselves into contention when Bryce got back. And Trey Turner had a much stronger second half of the year, and Nick Castellanos has had a good year. And even saw something recently, they could potentially have Rhys Hoskins back for the postseason. And if that happens, I don't know how much of the Rhys Hoskins, of old we can expect, but that's just one more piece in the arsenal for them. Philly is probably the one team that would make. Philly is the one team I think could make Atlanta nervous.
Okay.
I think Philly's story is, specifically, could be driving of that. They lost, last year in the World Series and have the opportunity to try to make it back and kind of have that called that media story behind them, the revenge story.
So
yeah.
They've had a taste of it, and I think Bryce has really come into his own as a leader on that club. I think I think they've got the fans totally behind them. It's a if they can keep if they can keep things strong, from the pitching side, I think, they could cause all kinds of trouble. Now the interesting thing, based on where they are right now, since Philly is the highest of the wild card seeds, they would host the first round, probably either
right now they would host Miami.
Right. So no,
Arizona.
Arizona.
They host Arizona right now. Okay.
Yeah. But if assuming Philly beats their opponent, and I think they will, whoever it is, the next round would be Philadelphia against Atlanta.
Yeah.
And I think the winner of that series would go on to the World Series.
There's two teams in the NL that we haven't talked about yet. One is the Dodgers, who easily won the NL West. Or, well, yeah, they did.
West, yeah.
Even though Arizona is probably a playoff team next to them, they still they won the division by 15 games so far. And so there's the Dodgers as a potential threat to the Braves, even though Clayton Kershaw is limping his way through the whole thing and still performing at a high level, even though he's probably at a 60% level. And so there's the Dodgers we have to consider as a possible. They're the second seed.
And, Dodgers also have a strong lineup. I mean, like I said, up until the end, Mookie Betts, absolutely MVP candidate. I think 40-70, secures it for Acuna, but I think my big questions with the Dodgers are going to be on the pitching side. You mentioned that Kershaw is, he's not as dominant as he used to be. LA is also, between injuries and off-field stuff, missing several of the pitchers that they had expected to count on. I think that's maybe where they're vulnerable. I think they get past whoever. I'm assuming Milwaukee is going to make it through against whoever their first round opponent is. I don't have any problem seeing LA beating Milwaukee, but I don't think LA gets past either Philly or Atlanta.
You mentioned the other team there in Milwaukee, and they're one of my only pride points from our first season preview because I picked them to win the NL Central, and I pointed to their pitching and said they're going with the mantra of defense wins championships, and they have the best pitching in baseball, the best defense, and that makes it interesting against a team like Atlanta and Philadelphia because Milwaukee's whole MO is to keep the ball in the park, and that's Atlanta's and LA's big ability to do. And so can Milwaukee make it tough on Atlanta and LA to advance because of their ability to keep the game at a 1-0 or 2-1 kind of ball game?
I mean, good pitching beats good defense and vice versa. I think the hardest thing with Milwaukee, I don't think the lineup is as strong as the other teams that we've talked about. And for Milwaukee to do it, they have to win 11 games. 10. But they have to win their series. They have to win 3 series. And I just don't see them outlasting 3 other clubs to get to the World Series.
That's fair. Last thing I'll mention about the NL is just my Colorado Rockies set a franchise record for losing 100 games this year, and I think we predicted that too. So anyway, Dustin, Cody, anything about the NL, National League playoff stuff?
I just Atlanta's so strong. Winning 100 games is kind of like the benchmark for greatness in baseball, and so the fact that Atlanta's been able to do that with a couple more games still to go to raise that, they're just automatically not only have the target but are kind of automatic favorites though. But Bob, I like what you said about Philly having that opportunity to take them down if they can get there. So be interesting to watch that.
Yeah, I think that could potentially be the most exciting series in the National League is Atlanta and Philly. It's worth noting for Atlanta, I don't think we mentioned it yet, because of their record, Dustin, that you just pointed out. They are at this point they have home field advantage throughout, so including the World Series. So that is something that will definitely play into the matchups as we look at that as well.
Yeah, as for me, I honestly don't have a whole lot to add to it. I think, like as we've already stated, the Braves and the Phillies, it's kind of theirs. But in my opinion, I think it really falls down on the Braves. It's theirs to lose, honestly, at this point. So I feel like I feel like the destiny is in their own hands, and they have the roster. If we've mentioned the talent, to be able and the home field advantage to make it to the World Series. And so that's what I would expect. But as stated, I would expect the Phillies to make it kind of difficult on them, but I don't see them pulling off a win against the dominant Braves. So
Yeah. As we move over to the AL, let me state this will be the first time in 30 years, I think, that we'll have a MLB postseason without the Yankees, Red Sox, or Cardinals at all. None of those three teams are in the playoffs for the first time since before Cody was born. So, so that's kind of fun.
that makes it really exciting. That's honestly my opinion with any sport. It's always super exciting when there's a massive change such as that. So it's just it gets old when a certain team or teams are always just present and there. So
Yeah.
Unless you're a fan of the Red Sox, right?
Parity
Okay.
is good for any sport.
Yeah. Okay, over to the American League. I think we all expected the Orioles to be good-ish. But the fact that they've won 100 games is probably really surprising to everyone, except maybe someone in Baltimore.
And especially when you stop and think about where they were 2 years ago. 2 years ago, they lost 110. And this year they're winning 100 and winning the division over Tampa Bay, New York, Toronto, Boston. They are not hiding from anybody. They've got, I think, they've got winning records against most of the teams in the American League. So doesn't matter. It's not like they've been feasting on bottom feeders. They've been beating good teams on a regular basis. They are legit, absolutely legit, and they have home field through the American League playoffs. So that's that. If anything, that I don't know if like the bright lights are going to phase them at all when they get into some of these series. They're a very young team, but they've been doing it all year long. So they're going to be a handful for anybody, no question.
I like what you said, just kind of the strength of this AL East division, and that depending on how Toronto finishes out, you could have three teams with 90 wins or more. And for Baltimore to be at the top of that is just, a hat off to their season, and they shouldn't be underrated in the playoffs. They should be the scariest team in the AL.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned the Rays. They're in the playoffs for the 6th straight season, and so the Tampa Bay Rays are always a model of consistency as well. But are they a challenger to unseat someone like the Orioles or or whoever comes out of the West, really, which we'll talk about in a second. But
well, Tampa Bay sitting, I think this morning, what was it, 97 wins. So, they're, they are a good team in their own right. They will host the first round. And at this point, it actually would be against Toronto if Toronto holds. And that they're finishing out the season against each other anyway. So we could be seeing a little bit of a preview of the first round of the playoffs. but no, I think if Tampa Bay wins through that first round, they will then play Baltimore. So they will go through their
Division, yeah.
their rivals in their division. But it's funny how, I mean, the American League, mentioned earlier, you've got 4 teams right now competing for 3 spots, and Toronto is one of those teams. And mentioned, the other 3, it's interesting that we don't even know yet who's winning the American League West. Whoever does win the West is going to have a better record than Minnesota. So Minnesota will have to host one of the early series. At this point, given the way the slots are lined up, that would be Houston. But there's so much that can happen right now. That Houston Texas series is going to tell an awful lot about what happens in the playoffs. I'm sorry. What did I say? No,
You're right.
Yeah. It's Texas, Seattle. Houston's playing Arizona. But those 2 series, there's so much that hangs on those. And Toronto, for having been in a playoff spot for most of the season, could fall out at the very end. So a lot of moving pieces, especially in the American League.
We've already mentioned the Twins, and they're the only representative in the AL Central, and so I think we can
deservedly so.
Yeah, and so now we talk about the Wild West.
Yes.
You mentioned that there's no clear favorite, or there's no clear winner yet in the AL West. We have 3 teams. Probably one of those teams is going to miss the playoffs. We don't know which one. Right now it would be Seattle, but they're right up there. All 3 of these teams are within 2 games of each other, and so Houston, as defending World Series champions, are they as dangerous as they've been? And this has been kind of a rough season for them, but
it has, and I'm amazed that Dusty Baker is under fire, for the way they played. I've heard his name mentioned as one of the people on the hot seat, after the season is over, depending on what happens. But I think, Houston is more vulnerable this year than they've been. If they do make it into the playoffs, right now they would go up against Minnesota. Minnesota would host that. Houston would be on the road. Could they get out of that? Sure. But then Texas is next. Texas, to me, is probably, it's just slightly out in front of either Houston or Seattle right now. 3 people in the major leagues right now have an OPS over 1. Everybody talks about Shohei Ohtani, and everybody's been talking about Ronald Acuna because of all the production, the home runs and stolen bases and so forth. The third one is Corey Seager, and if it weren't for Shohei Ohtani, I think people would be talking about what a monster season Corey Seager is having. Marcus Semien is playing well. It's a strong lineup. Texas is not a team I want to see, in the playoffs. I think, if it comes down to, if Houston wins through in the first round, it would be Houston versus Texas. I think Texas takes that, especially with home field advantage. And that sets up probably a Baltimore, Texas
AL
matchup
championship
for
series.
yeah, for the championship. And those to me are probably, maybe I'm not giving Tampa Bay enough credit, but I think I'm kind of feeling a Baltimore Texas matchup for the AL championship.
Yeah, that's what I picked too. So in the last minute plus we we will have a World Series preview as well later on in November. But so who's playing for the World Series? Who's winning? I have straight chalk. I have Baltimore and I have Atlanta, and I have Atlanta winning it.
I'll say Baltimore and Philadelphia, and Baltimore wins.
Wow.
I have Baltimore and Atlanta, and Baltimore wins.
Okay. I will say Atlanta and Texas, and Atlanta wins.
Yeah. Well, based on what we did for the season preview, it could be completely different by the time we get to November, but we will.
It could be completely different by the time we have lunch. So
that's true. We will talk about that as we get toward World Series. Next week, the three of us are talking NBA stuff, starting NBA season preview. Thanks, everyone, and happy postseason.
all right. Thanks all.